In the name of God, the most beneficent, the most merciful. All praise is due to the Lord, Master of all the worlds. And peace and blessings be on all his prophets, and especially the final prophet, the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him and his family. My dear brothers and sisters, I bid you the Islamic greeting of Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah wa barakatuh. Rasmus Paludan, the Danish extremist who burnt the Holy Quran, without a doubt caused shockwaves around much of the Muslim world and outrage in many non-Muslim circles. Many of us were in disbelief when we saw the Quran once again being burnt. This, of course, is not the first time the Quran's been burnt in history. On one note, one may look at the actions of the third Caliph Uthman in burning the Quran in early Islamic history, but that was towards the direction of canonization of a text. But when a person burns the Holy Quran full of venom, full of hatred, full of animosity, it brings about, without a doubt, much suspense, but at the same time, it brings about a certain level of oppression and a certain level of sadness within the world today. When one saw Terry Jones do this in Florida, we thought that that could mark the end of burning the Quran rituals in what are meant to be the most developed countries, which have the most developed concept of freedom of speech. But this same person, Rasmus Paludan, had been someone who went on a Quran burning tour last year in the holy month of Ramadan. Talk about hatred towards the religion of Islam. Now, when we're trying to examine this issue, how do we examine it? Because I know many of you have written into me wanting me to try and dissect this with as much depth as we could. And that's what we've decided to do. On the first level, I've looked at the issue and thought to myself that there is certainly a political undertone to what's happening. Swedish-Turkish relations are a bit checkered at the moment. And what happens in Stockholm and what's happening in Ankara very much has to do with security concerns. Erdogan has a particular concern with groups in Sweden. Sweden has a concern with its safety in terms of what's happening with Russia and the Ukraine. And all of a sudden, a Danish far-right personality comes forward, right-wing tendencies, who, if I'm not mistaken, if we look at Extra Bladet and the newspaper that comes forward and talks about a man who clearly has issues. Burning the Holy Quran and being proud of what you're doing, you've definitely got issues. But to come forward and go on a tour doing it, you've got even more issues. But that newspaper that I mentioned, Extra Bladet, started to mention that the man had also issues with certain pedophilic tendencies, talking about his sexual urges in front of young boys. So we clearly have somebody who has a racist past, a bigoted past, and may even have certain frustrations sexually. But more important, amongst the main debates that emerge from such an issue is the debate concerning freedom of speech and its boundaries. The same Sweden came forward recently and made sure that they disciplined a certain Rebecca Wallenqvist. When you look at Rebecca Wallenqvist, what you have with her is a particular person who has made insensitive comments towards the young Anne Frank. Anne Frank, of course, occupies a prominent position in the Jewish community, a person who had seen the atrocities that had taken place in World War II, documented it within a diary, documented oppression that had taken place, and therefore becomes a martyr in Jewish circles. So when somebody like Wallenqvist comes forward and attacks or tries to make fun of Anne Frank, automatically the Swedish Democrat Party come forward and state that this is not what we mean by freedom of speech. There is a line that's drawn that when freedom of speech becomes hate, when an action turns into insult, then a line has to be drawn. No doubt when a person tries to discuss or even have certain opinions which are negative towards any atrocity or crime that's happened in history, then the authorities have to step forward. When a person does this against Jewish history, they are straight away labeled as being anti-Semitic. Now, if a person decided, for example, with the rainbow flags that are on display virtually everywhere in Europe or in North America, if a person decides to get those rainbow flags and burn them all in one place, then automatically they are called homophobic. So now we have certain limitations to freedom of speech. A person who decides to denounce those who want to have a homosexual lifestyle, that person is called homophobic. If a person decides to, for example, like Rebecca Wallenqvist did, decides to make offensive remarks towards Anne Frank, that person is automatically labeled anti-Semitic. The authorities will jump on them straight away. But when a person decides that I want to burn the Quran, a book which is seen as arguably the most important book in the world today, whether a person likes the content of it or no, you know that the religion that has over 1 billion followers is the religion of Islam. And you know that Islam is generic in the sense that there are people who are educated, people who are uneducated, people who are cultural, people who are religious. But one thing that brings them all together is that they all have a reverence for the Holy Quran. There are Muslims who don't read the Quran the whole year, who don't practice what the Quran says, but they respect the Quran. The same way there are Christians who respect the Bible, the same way there are members of other religions who may respect the Gita or other holy texts. Likewise, when a person has a text like the Quran, the last thing you want to do is to try and come forward and burn it. But the saddest thing of all is anti-Semitism, homophobia, but when it came to Islam, it was freedom to speak, freedom to behave. While some of the Swedish authorities, and I must mention I have Swedish friends who don't believe and don't accept such things at all, but the reality is that there were Swedish authorities who had no problem with this man standing outside the Turkish embassy and burning a copy of the Quran. Now, why doesn't that hurt our feelings? If somebody who is part of the homosexual community feels that they are oppressed or that they are abused or that they are insulted when a symbol of theirs is, for example, burnt or a symbol of theirs is made fun of, I can understand that there should be a line that's drawn. If a member of the Jewish community is insulted when somebody comes forward and insults Anne Frank, then they have every right to say that's not freedom of speech. But why is it when it comes to Islam, the doors of freedom of speech are open and the sea is split apart in a Moses-type fashion for everybody to come forward and insult the religion of Islam? Is it that us Muslims don't have any feelings whatsoever? Have you forgotten that when you want to come forward and say the Quran is the book that has caused all this terrorism, that someone like Brenton Tarrant, for example, was inspired by the likes of Anders Breivik in coming forward and attacking all those people who were coming to our mosque in Christchurch, New Zealand? Everybody seems to forget that when Christchurch happens, what was the religion that was to blame for it? When a person sees a pedophile who's got Pedophile Island in the United States or from the United States of America, that person is not labeled as a member of a particular religion. He's just labeled as a freak. When a person is a Hollywood film producer and he ends up molesting or harassing a number of Hollywood actresses, no one talks about his religion. They just talk about the person being a pervert. But when it comes to a Muslim performing an action, automatically the gates open for you to insult Islam. I look at this person, and what's unbelievable is that in the name of freedom of speech, a person is allowed to do what they want, and the authorities are proud of it. Now, we saw this with Terry Jones in Florida. We saw this with Charlie Hebdo, that a person can come forward and insult a religious figure and no one bats an eyelid. It could be a religious scholar. You're not allowed to utter a word. Could be the Prophet Muhammad. You're not allowed to utter a word. But when it comes to Judaism or it comes to homophobia, a person comes forward straight away and the lawyers are out in great numbers. I don't believe that any religion or any way of life deserves to be at the receiving end of insults. We could say we could agree to disagree. We could differ in opinion. But there shouldn't be any space for insult or abuse. A person can come now and discuss the life of the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, and his family, or could even discuss some of the parts of the Quran. There are parts of the Quran that I, as a person who studied some of the Quran, can turn around and say that I don't necessarily understand the text or the context, or that I will never be able to put or allow myself to understand what was happening in Arabia at the time, because my world in the 21st century is so difficult, and therefore putting a modern spin on the Quran is sometimes unfair. I'm trying to somehow justify certain things that are happening in the Quran by my 21st century worldview or framework. But I don't mind if someone out there has an issue with some of the verses of the Quran. Just don't go out there and burn. When you go out there and burn, you're inciting hatred. And you're inciting even more Islamophobia, and us Muslims are the victims of Islamophobia, and it's as if everyone turns a blind eye. Does Islam allow freedom of speech? Yes, Islam does. Are there Muslims who don't allow freedom of speech? Yes, there are Muslims who don't allow freedom of speech. Are there Muslims in the world today who will even censor fellow Muslims? Yes, I've been at the receiving end of censoring on certain topics that I'm not allowed to discuss, or certain personalities that I am not allowed to critique in Islamic history. That censorship does exist. But if we look back at the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, and his family as an exemplary role model, the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, and his family had no problem with people amongst his companions even questioning his decisions. The problem wasn't going to be for him. It was going to be for them whether they were going to show full obedience to him or not. But some did raise their voices, as we see in Surah 49. Some revealed his secrets, as we see in Surah 66. Some were questioning some of his decisions, as we see in the event of Hudaybiyah. The Prophet Muhammad allowed freedom of speech, but did not want this to be the freedom to insult. Insulting and hatred is a line that has to be drawn. And that's why I call upon not just the Swedish authorities, but all those who have diplomatic relations with the Swedish authorities from Muslim and non-Muslim states to ask the question that how did someone get away with this? Last year, a book burning tour, and this year, burning the Quran. At the end of the day, we want to live in a society where all of us are really part of a society where we learn to agree to disagree, but respect each other's opinions. I may tolerate some of your opinions, but it doesn't mean that I have to accept them. But I certainly will live in a society where I tolerate. So let's try in this particular period to not only have a place of reverence for religion, where Europe seems to want to push this out altogether, but a place of reverence also for religious texts, where people want to undermine continuously religious texts as archaic. You may see them as archaic, we still have a value for them in our lives. There are many who have been inspired by passages of the Quran, if not all the Quran. And even if you've got no interest in reading the Quran, at least respect those who do. Thank you so much. Wassalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah wa barakatuh.